Me too.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Fullcast Fireside Chat. I'm your host, Tyler Simons, Head of Customer Success here at Fullcast, and we are a go-to-market planning and execution platform. Today's guest, Amy Lin with ngrok. Amy, why don't you give us a little details on your background and history?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Tyler. Really excited to chat with you. I think we've had a long relationship, even going further back than the ngrok relationship.
Yep.
I am currently at ngrok. ngrok is a software developer platform that helps developer get anything that's offline online. We've been around for almost 8 years. The first few years are really just our CEO founder in his garage creating a product because he found a great use case. He's an ex-developer, had a lot of trials where he had test pages he had to bring online to be able to test the code underneath it. Ended up discovering this product, ran it by himself. Fast forward to where we are today. Last year, we started hiring our first go-to-market sales and marketing folks who are not quite at their 1-year anniversary, and we've been growing since then. We are still hiring, trying to build our go-to-market motions. And I personally run revenue operations here, end-to-end operations, marketing, sales, a little bit of customer success when I get time. And so much of what we've been thinking through is how to set up the organization right for that go-to-market motion. And specifically, right, we're hiring sales folks. How do we incent them? How do we carve territories? How do we make sure we have coverage of our account base? And we're kind of in a unique situation. We have over 5 million users who have used our platform before we even hired a single marketer or a salesperson, just complete word of mouth. We had never sent an email out to our account base or customer base ever up until about a quarter ago.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a tremendous amount of growth. We're going for the other side, right? How do we mine that gold? Because we've had a couple of great use cases that our CEO, founder, software engineer has sold. And we know there's more out there, but we need to get more coverage because there's good stuff out there. We just need to figure out how to prioritize and plan to get towards it.
So today, you've had an interesting history just beyond ngrok, and you and I were kind of talking about like what is it that we feel like some people forget about or it's an afterthought, and we just really honed in on the topic around team selling, right? And what do we mean by team selling? It's like overlays and all those things that kind of go together. Everybody that helps to close that deal, and then even maybe continue to upsell and expansion and all that. But what we really want to bring together is team selling and territory planning today. How those two work together, and how do you make decisions around who needs to be on that team, whether you need different roles or not, or maybe you just have one person. I don't know. Hopefully we'll be able to get you that answer today. So let's just get started. Let's assume that we've got a buyer's journey. We've already established that, right? We know exactly what that is. How can we use that buyer's journey to inform which roles we should be thinking about to involve in the sales process?
Sure. I feel like, so I was at SaaStr 2 weeks ago, did the walk of booths, did the walk of seminars. And I feel like this term PLG has become product-led growth, has become this buzzword that all these companies are trying to use. And so much is a function of having such a great product that people come to your website, download a free trial, start using it, maybe even do like self-service paid before they become this big enterprise customer. And that customer journey is fairly common now. I think a lot of major companies have started adopting it. Twilio was probably the original OG of it, and that's where our CEO is originally ex-software developer from, around getting people to use the platform, liking it, adopting it, uncovering those awesome use cases, and then building the enterprise sale there, right? And so much of that is that journey is very specific. You've got people who are self-service, and then you got people you're trying to upsell into a bigger use case. That use case could be a centralized team use case, or hey, did you know our product can also do X, Y, and Z if you integrate it into other products? So you can integrate with different use cases that may not be available in a self-service model. And that journey is very specific, right? Because you got to make sure that you have coverage around all of those self-service people and coverage on enterprises that they may link into. And let's be honest, a product like ngrok, a lot of those users are actually hobbyists, people who are software developers, are curious, they got side projects, get side things they're working on, and you need to make sure that there is awareness of what those are too, right? So we're ngrok, we're actually thinking about those as two different buckets, but both sources of revenue. So early on, I've been here for about 90 days. We originally thought of it as even before ngrok, actually good context, before ngrok, I was at a company who was very enterprise sales driven product. The company's called Okta. It's a product where when you buy it whole hog, end to end, enterprise, you download it. It's a giant initiative that entire engineering teams adopt. And so we had hired people thinking, hey, that's the role. We're going to find those gold nuggets and we're going to hire towards that growth into enterprise use case. But we didn't realize that actually there's some places where customers are better set in self-service. There's some use cases where it's not worth actually asking them to move on to this enterprise committed annual in advance kind of contract. And so those two different aspects of the buyer journey, some people may never cross that jump into enterprise, but we still need to have people that service both sides of it. So we're actually thinking those as two different roles. Yeah. One that is core to growing into an enterprise business, and one that is there to actually continue to grow that self-service. And I uncover all use cases.
So it's almost like it's an evolving thing, right? I'm almost thinking okay, you might just get started and you have your buyer's journey. And you're looking at this and you're going, okay, let's just focus on this scenario where it's the PLG scenario where you've got a bunch of users already, and you want to start to really grow those into enterprise accounts. The ones that you could see oh, this could be an enterprise account. And so you're looking at that journey, right? And you're starting to map that process out and you're going, okay, we know we need to have somebody to quarterback this, to really figure things out. So let's start there. So that's typically for most people, I think maybe an account executive or an account manager, whatever you want to title it. But then from there, you might notice gaps in the process, and that's kind of this iteration. Or do you think that when you just look at this, you just know that, hey, these are the roles that we need. We need to have an account executive. This is actually a fairly complex product once we move into enterprise. So we need something else to kind of work out, like a sales engineer. Or do you see it more on the iterative side where you're on, oh, this is a gap in the sales process. Let's figure out, we need another role.
I think as someone we're building here, right? Still hiring sales folks. It's definitely an iterative process. We came in thinking we're going to staff to only the top 5% of users, and we're going to focus on that conversion. What we rapidly learn is because we didn't have much of marketing, the first conversation is actually the first part of the sales cycle, the opportunity life cycle that our sales reps are spending are actually a lot of education. It's a lot of education. It's a lot of awareness of, hey, did you know we could do this? Hey, did you know we could do that? And that actually isn't, if you're hiring great enterprise sales folks, isn't necessarily where I want them to spend their time. I want their time spent with the sales engineer, just doing the demo process, setting up a demo for the right business value setup to get to that, because we know we can do things technically, and to get to that business win, right? And that's that value selling that even a PLG organization is still incredibly important. That's a very specific skill set that I don't need if someone's doing that education, right? So actually, what we thought through around some of this was a lot of organizations actually think about the SDR, BDR, ADR, MDR, XDR, right? As an extension of marketing, as an extension of hey, we're actually here to educate. We're here to inform folks. There's a lead that comes in. How can I help you? We see that you're using this resource. And the original, and now today, it's oh, I just need to, you were the person I need to get through to immunity, right? But the original notion around that was someone who was going to help continue to evolve and mature that lead into someone who's ready for a sales conversation.
Yeah.
The comp plans, SCRs are basically going, hey, do you have bench? Do you have budget authority, need, and timeline? If you do, I'm going to pitch you over to my A. And that's not the intent of it. So
Yeah.
what if you could actually reframe the concept of that SDR role, give them some more ammo, develop a comp plan, but also align them to a physical territory where their job is to, in a PLG world, mature some of the self-service people, do some basic education. And you know what? There's going to be some small use cases that are great transitions. Hey, I'm a company for Engrock. I have a company where we have a lot of developers using us. We want to be able to use your product to be able to standardize the way we actually function as an engineering org. Great. Take down that order. I want to empower those people who were doing that education and know that basic use case really well. I want to empower them to actually close that deal. Right. So we're actually creating this concept of this overlay territory that has a specific use case, development and education of the user base, and also can actually help create time for those big potential sales, the value sells. Take time to actually close the easy ones to keep my value sellers selling the big value pieces. And at the same time, we're learning more, right? We have not completely developed our product to understand how users are using our platform. And we're having these, we're going to call them inside sales reps likely. Think about, how do I actually prospect into that? How do I understand? And how do I help the company make some money, grow the revenue base, while understanding, actually digging in to understand how someone uses stuff. So not asking literally, do you have Bant? But to understand how to set up value, right? To actually then pitch it over to someone who's a value sell, more of an enterprise executive sale.
Yeah. I don't want to go, I just want to touch on this. Maybe it's just like a highlight, is that the Bant piece versus the education. And then, I think you were kind of teasing this idea of like, well, if somebody says I want to buy, let's just get the sale done, right? I think that piece really comes from, you really want to tie that in with how you compensate, like compensation design, right? So think about that. If you're just compensating an XDR on purely Bant, that's what they're going to do. They don't care about anything else. So think about that. But we'll just parking lot that now, because I think what's interesting here is the question of what we should be considering when designing this go-to-market coverage, right? So you kind of briefly touched on this, where we've got this account executive that's going to be working on these big deals. And then you've got essentially an XDR that you would align to a territory. So when we're thinking about this, what sorts of questions should we be asking in terms of just designing that coverage when we both think about like these, what am I trying to get at? It's like, we've got these two people, right? Do we align these people? Do we not? How do we think about our go-to-market coverage for both those roles? And do we bridge the gap or not, I guess, is kind of where I'm getting.
Yeah. I think there's two aspects that I think about. One is like the physical territory, right? We're here to talk about territories. How do you talk about the physical territory coverage? And the other piece of thing I think about is like roles and responsibilities, which is a little more nebulous and difficult to actually piece through. And it kind of touches on compensation a bit. So to talk about first about the physical territories, there's really two ways you can think about it. You can either map an XDR inside an inside sales rep on a completely different geography than your AEs. I've seen this in cases of like, I think a lot of SDR organizations are actually set up the way they, hey, here's your geography, AEs, here's your geography. And generally it'll be very closely aligned to say, hey, like most of your leads are going to go to these three people. There might be some partial AE coverage in there. And I've seen that model work because what their motion is so wildly different, it doesn't quite matter, right? Because one person's doing education, one person's sourcing and qualifying leads, the other person's closing them. But what I found that works a little better, but it's more difficult, is a mapping directly to a rep. So I've seen organizations say like, hey, SDR, these are specifically your AEs. It's usually one SDR has multiple AEs that they're covering, and the AEs will work directly with the SDR. It develops a relationship between them and develops a lot of very strong mentorship too. Those AEs are incented, right? This is my dedicated SDR. I will talk to them all the time and help coach them and help them help me qualify my leads. The challenge that you potentially run into in those situations is what happens when there's turnover, right? We are in a world of, or I think we're coming out of this great resignation period where folks are leaving organizations. There's open roles. What happens if you have AE roles that are open with an SDR? Who's going to help take down some of those conversations, and vice versa? What happens if AEs who don't have an SDR? Are they going to be severely detrimented because they don't have a dedicated SDR person in that specific role? Yes, there's been coverage, but by comparison to their peers, they may not have that one-on-one relationship they're really looking for. And so you have to think about both sides of that, whether when you do it by people or by physical territory or by a round robin that just kind of maps wherever. I think it also is an evolution of how you want to sell your product as well. If you're thinking about, again, something that cuts off very easily, that first model of geographic mapping or round robin into AE mapping is relatively easy to stand up. It's really easy to create as you learn. The other side is a little bit more complex. It implies some like very specific relationships where that partnership is more meaningful.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring this back to our buyer's journey again, because I love it. I feel like the first model, SDR world, enterprise world, where you have all these roles kind of just doing their own thing. And this could also be CSMs and account managers all on their own,
Absolutely.
right? Like, so we're talking specific about SDRs and AEs right now, but this applies across the org. When they're in their own worlds, it doesn't necessarily optimize for the customer experience or the customer relationship. And maybe if there's like a little, it's more transactional, that's where this really works. And I think that's kind of where you have to have this idea of what happens with the customer, how do they buy, and how does that, I guess, really just how do they buy, right? And if you feel like it's more transactional and you can get away with those models, you probably have more quality in terms of opportunities across your reps. You can deal with the scenario where you have SDRs that leave or AEs that leave and all these things. But now, as soon as you start to think about the customer experience across your buyer's journey, where you need that relationship and you're building this long term, that might be this impetus to go to, well, we need our SDRs to work more closely with the AEs and the account managers and the CSMs and so on and so forth, right? And so I think that's kind of where we start to move into this world of all these overlays.
Yes. And Tyler, I'm actually really glad that you brought up account managers. And I think specifically right now, we are in this time of uncertainty. We are shifting into a potential recession. I actually don't know what makes it officially a recession other than people panicking enough that it's officially a recession.
I think we panic and then we create it, so it's fine.
Well, let's be honest. A lot of sellers today, a lot of people who work in tech have never sold in a time of recession. It's been 14 years since 2008. A lot of sellers out there were not sellers in 2008. A lot of tech companies were not around in 2008. We're thinking about probably like Salesforce, maybe Workday was around back then, but that's a long time ago. And because of that, the role of the account manager or a CSM changes significantly, right? Because if companies are thinking about where they're spending, tightening their budgets, considering consolidating products, it becomes this opportunity for a lot of companies to actually potentially cancel contracts that are not core to the business. And so that relationship between the AE CSM is even more important. That if it used to be territory based, you may want to actually consider about thinking of marrying the AE CSM, AM CSM together, because more companies are likely going to start thinking about their budgets, thinking about, do they still want to keep this contract around that they've had? Can they consolidate it? Is it duplicative of other things they have? And it's important for those AE CSMs to start identifying those potential situations and flagging them to the AEs, and actually, again, going back to kind of territories drives how you want to send and focus your teams, but then compensation actually drives behavior. Think about how you also think about changing the compensation about that specific change.
Yeah. We're going to get to territory planning now. Yeah. So let's say we've decided on our roles for now. We're going to iterate on this, but we know that we've got the two roles. So this is the problem that at least I feel exists in this market, is we've spent all this time focused on one role, namely, typically the account executives. We build all these territories and then it's like, oh, we've got these other roles. Let's just slam these in here, afterthought. Can you walk us through what you think should be a typical like planning process when you have these multiple roles?
Yeah, I think planning inherently to me comes down to a function of uh, comp models, targets that align with comp models, how you set those targets based off of territory mixes, and how that territory mix actually makes sense and gets settled, right? I think a lot of companies think about the AE territory the most because that's where they're paying the money, paying the most money for the most upside. And they don't think about support models as much because they tend to not pay out as much, right? Like SDR comp
Yep.
models tend to be like an 80-20 ratio versus an AE is a 50-50. So even inherently, if you staff more people, what you're paying out in compensation is bigger for the AEs. So I think that's why a lot of folks focus on territories for AEs first, and then some of those territory overlays, right? It's direct correlation to revenue. But I'm also going to say that when you are a larger company, if you have a big account base and you think about that role of the account manager, that actually you need to think about like what is the potential risk to your business if you don't model off of AM and then backing into AE relationships, right? Especially if you have a people to people mapping. And I think so much of that is understanding, again, different aspects of the customer journey. What do those ratios look like? What do those conversion rates look like between leads in certain geographies or verticals or segments, depending how you actually create territories? How do they come in through leads? How do they become early stage opportunities, sales accepted opportunities, the opportunity, what you have there into bookings, as well as then customers and potential attrition, right? Because you can also potentially understand that different segments may have different attrition rates, different verticals may have different attrition rates or growth rates, right? Net retention rates that you think about how you actually want to staff those account managers differently than the account executives themselves.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm going to come back to this because there's something important there. But I do want to talk quickly. I just want to address this, which is how do you make a decision between a single go-to-market where you have all these roles aligned to each other versus multiple go-to-markets where you might want to break them out and do different go-to-market modeling? I can give more examples if that wasn't clear.
Yeah, I think you're saying like, hey, wouldn't you actually have completely different segments or verticals that have completely different
Yep.
motions to them? Leadership stack, right? That probably is the easiest way to think about it, right? Like
Sure.
different leaderships for, I think about at Okta, we had different segments. So we had public sector had its own management team. We had then like enterprise bands of reps and commercial bands of reps where enterprise larger companies, commercial smaller companies, but completely different leadership. I also think about previously, even before Okta was at a company called LinkedIn. People heard of them, but they also have different verticals as well, right? They had one sales organization tackling the talent solutions, how they sell to recruiters, and a different vertical, completely different management structure, selling against the sales solutions product, and then a different one for marketing solutions as well. And I think similar to that is how different are those buyers? Are the buyers completely different? And how they function, again, going back to your question, the early thing that you brought up, the buyer journey. How wildly different is that buyer journey?
Yeah.
Right? You think at LinkedIn, they're completely different buyers. The way that a marketer buys is very different from the way that a recruiter buys, it's different from sales organization buys. At Okta, the way we thought about like selling the public sector is a completely different marketing awareness, consideration, early intent marketing process. And it is also a very wildly different closing process, right? The concept of like selling to a government without going through the annual fiscal budgeting process is you have to be going through that process, versus in commercial you could have just one IT manager that purchases, right? So those are wildly different buying journeys. And I think the buying journey, and specifically how it correlates to marketing, I think informs a lot of how the sales organization really should be breaking up as well.
Yeah. There's another thing that I see on our end, and maybe this is just my simplistic view of things, but I'll just give this scenario where you see the AE org as one go-to-market and the CSM world as another go-to-market, and largely due to the fact that you can't predict where your customers are going to come from. And you might, from the CSM side, think about it to your point, like the buyer journey, those customers are treated differently based off of how much they're spending with you, because they act differently at that point. They, if they're spending like 500,000 with you versus a customer that's spending 1,000, they're probably going to have different expectations, and therefore different overlays or different roles need to be allocated that way. So that's another thing that I've just been thinking about in terms of just like dealing with these overlays and figuring out, like, are we going to just be able to roll this into one go-to-market, or are we kind of need to start to think about these a little bit separately? And in the planning process itself, you should leave time to make sure you try to compare these two worlds, because you really don't want a CSM working with like 50 AEs. If you can help it, you can reduce that. So there is this, like, I don't know, it's like back and forth, like, okay, you do this, all right, I'm going to kind of update this, maybe tweak it, okay, maybe we make tweaks over here, and this back and forth, I think, in the planning process that exists. So that said, I think this last piece here, which is like balancing these territories when multiple roles exist, and I think this kind of comes back to where we were talking about compensation and the territory mix, and we're going to go back to our scenario of XDRs and AEs, right? It might be said that the opportunity could be different if you're looking at it from a BDR lens or an XDR lens. I keep using whatever I want there. And then an AE lens. How do you balance the two worlds if you're going to align them on the same territory structure? Or do you just kind of balance them for AEs and then kind of move on from there?
Well, I feel like you're balancing them across the organization at the same time, right? Because inherently there is a reason you're staffing a certain number of XDRs versus a certain number of AEs versus a certain number of AMs, because your business inherently flows that way. I think the XDR AE ratios tend to be a function of conversion rates. How many leads do you get, and what percentage of those convert into opportunities, and your opportunity to close ratios, right? So companies that are selling faster transactions are probably going to have the companies that have a higher conversion rate because customers are more educated will have a closer tie between them, right? Because you're, in theory, the number of leads that your XDRs are touching is closer to the volume that your AEs are working through.
Yeah.
Versus organizations where it's a bigger sale and the conversion rates tend to be a little lower, you're probably going to be more focused on solving one for the revenue and then working backwards in the AEs. I really think it's a function of that funnel of how wide the funnel is versus how narrow the funnel. The narrow the funnel, you can plan for both at the same time. If it's super wide, I think you optimize for the bottom because that's going to be the most meaningful. And then you staff to what you need to get through the top of the funnel.
Awesome. I told you this was going to be short. So
there's so many things that you touched on that I still think about.
I know we're basically out of time. I like this because, it's easy. It's an easy time commitment to watch, and you can get down to the 30 minutes, but we do run out of time. Silver bullet for us. What do you think is the key takeaway for everything we talked about? I mean, we talked about buyer's journey, really informing these roles, figuring that out, a little bit of the territory planning process, some of the alignment between the two, whether we do align them or not, right? And then how important quota and compensation is.
Yeah.
So if there's one thing I needed to learn from this, Amy, what is it? What is it that I need to take away?
It's absolutely that buyer's journey, right? And understanding that buyer's journey informs how you think about your organization. And I would say for anyone who's listening, who is thinking about it, think about how the change of economy affects your buyer's journey. Not just your buyers, but your rebuyers and your customers before they leave, before they potentially leave, depending on what you're selling. Think about how that should inform the way you have roles, carve their territories and coverage around them. And then ultimately how you continue to compensate them in the future.
Yeah, the rest is easy after that. Yeah. You don't need to do anything else. I agree. I think that's the key takeaway for us. So, Amy, Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm glad that we finally connected. I mean, it's been so long since we've had this conversation and like we've been able to catch up. So it's great to be able to do this over our little fireside chat.
Great
Thanks
chatting
again.
with you. I
And
enjoyed
thank
it.
you. Yeah, that's great. It was really fun. And thank you all for joining. And until next time, we'll see you at the next fireside chat.